This is the Evergreen Empire.
Green grow the forests and fair flow the streams. The gentle deer grazes, the wild blossom gleams. From ocean wave raging to mountain serene, all nature's proclaiming our land's evergreen.
Welcome to Columbia Conversations. I'm Feliks Banel, editor of Columbia Magazine for the Washington State Historical Society. On this episode, we speak with Dennis Larsen, author of 4 books about 19th century Northwest settler Ezra Meeker, including his most recent, Saving the Oregon Trail, Ezra Meeker's Last Grand Quest.
He actually came into the city with a covered wagon and ox team and immediately got arrested for violating city ordinances. and they impounded his wagon and ox team.
I spoke with Dennis Larsen by phone from his home in Olympia. Dennis Larsen, thanks for joining us on Columbia Conversations. Now, you published a book, I think it was last year, called Saving the Oregon Trail, Ezra Meeker's Last Grand Quest. Before we get into the book, for someone who might have no idea who Ezra Meeker was, who was Ezra Meeker?
Okay, Ezra Meeker was a typical pioneer of the 1850s. In 1852, he left his home in Iowa and trekked west over the Oregon Trail and arrived eventually in Puget Sound. And for the first several years here, he was a struggling pioneer. He was tried a few business enterprises that failed. He tried farming up in the Fern Hill area in Tacoma, and that failed. And so about 1862, he threw in the towel and living in the Tacoma-Stelicum area and said, I'm going to move to the Puyallup Valley. And so he got down to the Puyallup Valley, and he was pretty much broke when he arrived down there and started homesteading and clearing land. And in the mid-1860s, he and his father started experimenting with hop growing. And they quickly discovered that they could make more money growing hops than they could doing typical farming. And so he personally transitioned really quickly into becoming a major hop grower in the valley. And he made a lot of money doing it. And he kept expanding, and then he started a brokerage business, and he started buying hops from other growers around and selling those. And eventually, when the railroads came west, he managed to start sending hops to the East Coast. And in the mid-1800s, 1880s, he pioneered the hop trade with London, England. And in the process, he became probably one of the wealthiest men in Washington Territory, if not the wealthiest. And in the 1890s, it all went bust because he overextended, he didn't diversify, and hop lice invaded the West Coast and kind of took away a competitive advantage that we had. The East Coast and England had been fighting hop lice forever, and the West Coast, for their infancy, didn't have that problem. But the lice came west on the hop trains, and so I think it was 1890 when they exploded all over the West Coast. So he was looking at bankruptcy again, and so in his mid-60s, around age 65 or so, he decided to join the Klondike Gold Rush, and he went up over Chilkoot Pass the first year when everybody went over there with about 2 tons of groceries and started a store in Dawson. He floated down built a boat, floated down the Yukon River, and built a store in Dawson, sold everything he had in about a month or 2, came out over the Dalton Trail, made his way back to Puyallup, picked up his son-in-law, and went back up over the Dawson Trail in September and into Dawson, and stayed the winter. And he ended up staying up there for 4 years. He'd come down off and on to resupply and to connect with his family and stuff. And he dabbled in gold and stuff up there. And while he was up there, he started thinking about the Oregon Trail. He started writing letters to his wife saying, my experience coming up here and everything was pretty similar to the Oregon Trail. He says it was boats going down the river instead of covered wagons, but, he was pretty interested in that. And so for his 50th wedding anniversary, he came back to Puyallup, and his family pretty much convinced him to stay. But he was an incredibly restless individual, and he became the president of the Washington State Historical Society. He was got in conflicts with the current secretary at the time, and so anyhow, he ended up resigning from the presidency and said, "I'm going to do something else," and he started writing a book about his pioneer experience coming over the Oregon Trail and settling in Washington Territory. And in the process of writing that book, he became enamored with the thought that the trail is disappearing, and the memory of what the pioneers of his generation had accomplished is disappearing. He says they're all dying, and we're not, our legacy is gone. And so he decided that he was going to make sure that the legacy of the pioneers and the trail, as much of it as was around, could be remembered and saved. And so in 1906, he took a covered wagon and an ox team at age 75 and started east over the Oregon Trail. And he had a dog with him also. He went through a couple helpers that, he started in February up in Seattle, and he did lectures at various cities along the way, starting in Seattle and hitting Kent and Auburn and Tacoma and on south down to Portland. And when he got to Portland, he tried to talk a local church into kind of sponsoring him, and the minister got up there and he said, "No way in the world should anyone in this congregation give that man a penny, because all he's going to do is go out on the Great Plains and die." And his daughter was appalled, and she wrote letters to him and said, "People are going to laugh at you. You're 75 years old," and he just kind of ignored her too. And he took off, and he went to the Dalles, where he actually really started. And a drifter kind of came into camp called William Mardon, and he says, "I hear you're looking for a job, somebody to help you." And he said, "Yeah." And he said, but Meeker wrote, he looked over Mardon and he said, "I don't know if this guy's what I want." But they stuck, and it was a partnership that lasted for 4 years. And without Mardon, Meeker could not have accomplished half of what he did.
Now, but one thing before you get further along, I know Meeker wrote a number of books. Had he written all of those before he headed off on this journey, or did that stuff come a little bit later?
No, he wrote the first one, Pioneer Reminiscences, and he published that in 1905, and that was just before he left on the trip.
Okay.
And then as he was going east, he was writing a book about what he was doing.
Got it.
And when he got to Nebraska, he published it, and he then sold that book as he headed east. And it took him 3 years to do this journey, and the book went through 4 printings, and he sold 10,000 copies.
Do you get a sense that there was some reason why he didn't want to stay home?
He was just restless, and he was, he had a happy marriage. He got along with his wife and his kids and everything. He had this drive in him that he could not calm down. And he was more happy when he was doing these adventures, like going up to the Klondike and, going on the Oregon Trail and going to London, England, when he was doing the hop business. And he was just, from the very beginning, restless and had this urge to accomplish things. And, people have asked me, well, where'd the spark come from? And I think it was inherited. He had ancestors that had been coming west gradually over the generations. He had a great-grandfather who fought in the American Revolution and drafted every one of his kids to come in and join him in the American Revolution. So it was his great-great-grand ancestor who founded New Jersey, got involved in kicking the British government out of New Jersey. So it was an inherited trait that found overdrive in him.
And,
I mean,
and as he's working his way east, from Seattle and Portland and the Dalles and everything, what kind of reception is he getting from local people? I mean, are they putting him up, letting him camp in their yards, or where does he stay along the way?
Well, he had done a lot of advance work. He didn't just jump out there and say, I was going to do this. He had written ahead a lot. He had a slideshow that he did about the Oregon Trail. He arranged for lecture halls ahead of time and things like that. So at each stop, he would want to put up a monument, a stone monument. And he would get the townspeople to finance the stone monument, and he'd do a dedication ceremony, and he'd have the school kids come and pile stones by the monument as a way of them to kind of have ownership of it, and they would, take part in the dedication ceremony and things. And he got free meals, almost everywhere. He got free lodging almost everywhere. But in a lot of it, they were out sleeping in the wagon. Because in the middle of Wyoming, there's not a lot in 1906.
And how many of those monuments were dedicated, and then how many remain?
When he was doing it, he put up around 20-some monuments himself, and by the time he was done, there were about 150 along the trail, and now there's probably closer to maybe 500 along the trail. And of the ones that he was involved in putting up, all of them are still standing except for two.
Which were the two that went away?
He put one up at the top of Ladd's Canyon in eastern Oregon in the Blue Mountains, and that one we think disappeared when they built the freeway through there.
Wow.
And the other one was on private property down in this bottom corner of eastern Oregon by a place called Lime. And that one may still be there. The property owner is not been willing to let anybody on his property. we know there is an Oregon Trail monument. A monument to some people who were killed on the Oregon Trail and died.
Wow.
And we know that's on his property because somehow a picture of that got out. And Meeker said that he put the monument up within visual distance of that, but I've never been able to get in there, and nobody that I've contacted has been able to get in there. So
wow.
That one may still be there.
Wow. And what was the eastern terminus? Was it Independence, Missouri, or did he go to some other destination at the eastern end of the trail?
No, he was heading for Council Bluffs.
Okay.
That's where he started from. But he made it all the way to Indianapolis the first winter. He wintered in Indianapolis. The next year, he spent the whole year going through Ohio, going through New York, and he got to New York City in September, and he managed to get allowed to camp in New York City. He actually came into the city with a covered wagon and ox team and immediately got arrested for violating city ordinances. and they impounded his wagon and ox team. Well, he went to the city council, and they, waived the rule, and so he was allowed to camp in Central Park. And he then one day drove over the Brooklyn Bridge. He was allowed to do that. And another day he drove all the way down Broadway to the bottom of Broadway, and the crowds were in the tens of thousands. And
wow.
he became a national celebrity at that point. And then he continued on to Washington, D.C. for a meeting with Teddy Roosevelt.
I'll be darned. And, you get a sense of what his personality was like based on all these different things you've described that he accomplished, especially as he got later into his life. Do you get any sense of what he was like as a person?
He was one of these guys you either liked or hated. There was no in between.
What do you mean? Tell me about that.
Okay. Well, he was like a bull when he got onto a project. He would not let go. And if somebody stood in his way, he would just run over them if he could. If he couldn't run over them, he would go around them. But if you were as part of the project, you were his best friend, and he had he didn't hold grudges. You know who Edmund Meany was?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. Tell us, because some people listening might not know who Edmund Meany was. Who was Edmund Meany?
he was a professor at the University of Washington and the head of the history department, and Meany Hall's named after him up there, and he was very well known in Washington during his day. And, well, he and Meeker were joint chairman of the Washington exhibit to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and Meeker was named the commissioner and Meany was an underling, but they got in a fight over what was going on, and the fight took place on the front pages of the Seattle Times. And eventually Meany engineered Meeker's firing from his position as head of the Washington delegation. And then they got into it again in 1905 when he published his book, because Meeker called the Isaac Stevens a drunk. And he said Isaac Stevens was the reason, his drunkenness was the reason for the Indian Wars.
Yeah.
He said, and Meany went after Meeker in the pages and says, no way, he was never a drunk. He couldn't have accomplished everything he did. And that got fought out in the Seattle Times also. And then when Meeker started East, he needed somebody to manage the money that he was collecting. And he put a committee together of 3 guys, and he asked Meany to be one of the 3 guys, and Meany agreed. So,
I guess it was a smaller town back then. There were fewer people to choose from, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
I've seen these pictures of Ezra Meeker, one on the cover of your book where he's got a leg up on the running board of the specially converted, what is it? Is it a Ford that's been converted to a prairie schooner?
Yeah, it's a Ford. Yeah.
And he has a look, with his dapper suit and his beard and his hat and his cane. Was there a certain amount of vanity or vainness with Meeker?
Not really. I don't think he had vanity in him at all. He knew how publicity worked, and he was a master at that. And he did. He was on first name basis with governors and congressmen and senators and even 5 presidents of the United States. And so he could live in a covered wagon, and he could hobnob with these kind of people and have no trouble making the transition. I mean, there was not a vain bone in his body. When they built the Meeker mansion, that was his wife's idea. He was content to live in a log cabin. And he did a second trip over the Oregon Trail from 1910 through 1912. And then in 1916, he got an automobile built called the Pathfinder that looked like the one on the cover of the book somewhat. It was, I think, the nation's first RV. And he traveled across the Oregon Trail in that in 1916 during a period when there were hardly any roads. In the early 1920s, he convinced the Army to fly him in an Army biplane over the Oregon Trail to Dayton, Ohio, and then on to Washington, D.C. And so he met with Calvin Coolidge at that point. And then this picture on the cover of the book is taken in 1927, just a little bit before, in 1928, just a little bit before he got ill and died. Henry Ford had built this for him, and he drove it from, he had a driver, because he never knew how to drive. And he got a driver to drive, several drivers actually, and he got them to drive him to the Ford factory where Ford said he was going to put some better brakes on it. And Meeker fell ill there, and the wagon stayed at the Ford factory, and they put Meeker on a train and sent him back to Seattle. And he recovered briefly, and then he relapsed, and his dying words that he whispered to his daughter is, "I can't go yet. I've got too much work to do."
Oh, wow.
And he was almost 98 years old.
Wow. Couple more questions for you. Now that specifically, the vehicle that's on the cover of your book, does that vehicle still exist somewhere?
No, they've looked for it high and low. And the last after Meeker died, he started an organization called the Oregon Trails Memorial Association, OTMA, and they took over the wagon, the Oxmobile they called it, and it showed up at an event at Independence Rock in Wyoming, and it showed up at a couple Boy Scout events, And then sometime in the 1940s, it just disappeared. And Ford doesn't have a record of where it went or what happened to it or anything. So I suspect it ended up in the junkyard somewhere, but we don't know.
Now, for your research, have you driven long stretches of this trail and kind of recreated parts of the route?
I've been over the Oregon Trail probably a half a dozen times or more, and what started me off in this was looking for the monuments that Meeker put up. And so my wife and I, just for a fun hobby, when I was still teaching, we were trying to find the monuments that he put up through Washington and Oregon and Idaho and so on. And then I discovered that you guys own the Meeker papers. You have, like 14 archival boxes. And so I have been transcribing those things for 2 decades.
Oh.
And the letters in there and the journals and things that are in there opened my view that this guy was way more complicated than one might know. And so that's when I started writing the books. And I've done 4 books about him and, pretty much covered his life. And it couldn't happen without the Meeker papers that are sitting in the research center in Tacoma.
That's great that they're being put to use. That's the access part. It's preservation and access, and without the access, it's sort of pointless. So I'm thrilled to hear you're using them to that degree. That's excellent.
They helped create 4 books.
That's fabulous. So in your travels and looking for the monuments and going through the papers, would you say that he was successful in his quest to save the Oregon Trail?
I think he was successful beyond his wildest dreams. I mean, he fought tooth and nail right up to the day he died to memorialize the trail. And the organizations like the OCTA, the Oregon California Trails Association, consider Meeker, their mentor, basically. I mean, he just spawned a movement that eventually led to the National Trails Act, and the Oregon Trail is now protected. What's left of it is protected under the National Park Service, and there are interpretive centers all along the Oregon Trail now. Like Baker City's got an amazing one in Eastern Oregon. There in Elko, Nevada's got one, and they're just Omaha, Nebraska's got a great one at the Mormon Center, and so I would say he was successful.
And Meeker's legacy, apart from what he did as a businessman and then with his efforts to bring attention to the Oregon Trail, I think he was on the jury that for Leschi, right?
Right, yes, and he refused to convict. That led to a hung jury. Well, he and one other guy. This was a war. He said it was an act of war. And he says, besides, Leschi could not have been where the prosecution said he was. And he basically proved it eventually, that Leschi could not have been involved in the murder that he was convicted of.
So, can we say that Meeker was he fairly progressive? Did he harbor any sort of racist things that came out later, or is he sort of does his record sort of stand up to the scrutiny of 150 years later when we kind of look at people from a different time and hold them up to our current standards? Does he still sort of pass the politically correct test or the wokeness test? He was way ahead of his times.
When the anti-Chinese movement was going on in Tacoma, he fought it tooth and nail. He even testified against the mayor of Tacoma and others who were involved in it at a grand jury, trying to get them arrested. He supported women's right to vote. He was a financial donator to it. His wife held meetings in the mansion, and he attended the Women's Rights Convention. He knew Susan B. Anthony on a first name basis, and so I would say he was ahead of his time.
And so, based on all that, based on what he accomplished, and based on what kind of guy he seems to have been, is he as well known as he should be in the Evergreen State?
I would say not in the Evergreen State, although there are a ton of things here in this state that are named Meeker. Go down the main street in Kent. You go down Meeker Street. In Puyallup, Meeker managed to save the name Pioneer Avenue for Puyallup because they were going to just use numbers. And he said, no, you can use numbers elsewhere, but this street's Pioneer Street, And, so I would say that he's better known in Oregon Trail circles and nationally, especially nationally, and than he is known here in Washington State. Hopefully my books have changed some of that, but,
Yeah. And your book's a fabulous summertime read. I mean, it's a great read any time of year, but a perfect thing to pick up for the summer, especially in a time when people are, I think, itching to get out and travel more and get on the road where they haven't been able to so much in the last year or so. So, Dennis Larsen, thank you for joining us on Columbia Conversations, and thanks for all your work on making those records that are being preserved at the State Historical Society, bringing them to life and helping them reach new audiences. That's priceless work. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to Dennis Larsen for speaking with me for this episode of Columbia Conversations from the Washington State Historical Society. Larsen's most recent book is called Saving the Oregon Trail, Ezra Meeker's Last Grand Quest. It was published in 2020 by WSU Press. For more information about Columbia Magazine or to subscribe, please visit washingtonhistory.org. I'm Feliks Banel.